Welcome remotely from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Amanda Cucci, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar series held in partnership with the U.S. Geological Survey's National Climate Adaptation Science Center. Today's webinar is titled Timing is Everything: How Fish and Wildlife Are Responding to Climate Change Through Shifts in the Timing of Life Events. We are excited to have Michelle Staudinger from the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center and Adrian Jordan from the University of Massachusetts Amherst with us today. To introduce our presenters today, we have David Reed Miller, Acting Director of the Northeast and Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Centers, who will do the honors to start us off and introduce today's speakers.
Great, thanks Amanda. So first off, we've got Michelle. She is the Science Coordinator of the Department of the Interior's Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center and an adjunct faculty at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She received her BS in Marine Biology and Environmental Science from Boston University, her MS in Marine and Atmospheric Science from Stony Brook, and her PhD in Marine Science and Technology and Natural Resources Conservation from UMass. Michelle contributed to both the 2013 and the 2018 National Climate Assessments, where I had the pleasure of working with her. And her research interests seek to understand how climate change, fishing pressure, and other stressors impact marine and coastal fish and wildlife, and to develop adaptation strategies to reduce risk and vulnerability. Adrian is the director of the Gloucester Marine Station and an associate professor of fish population ecology and conservation in the Department of Environmental Conservation at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. His research employs quantitative modeling and statistical approaches to understand ecological patterns and life processes in marine, nearshore, and freshwater systems. He is particularly interested in the links between ecosystems, the services they provide, and resource management. A critical part of this research focus is the engagement of fisheries practitioners and other stakeholders and managers towards finding the quote-unquote sweet spots where science can advance sustainability and enhance access to resources. With that, I'm happy to turn it over to our presenters and look forward to the presentation.
All right, well, thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. Really excited to have this opportunity, and so I'm going to get right to it. The first thing is I was going to launch into talking about phenology, and I realized that I hadn't really defined it, but it's in our title. So phenology is this changing in these life events, the timing of life events. And so with that, I'm just going to start moving through this. I'd like to ask everybody, how do you know spring has arrived? Knowing that a lot of you are further south than us here, you're asking like, well, that happened a long time ago. Well, for us, it's just kind of happening up here in the hills around Amherst and Massachusetts. In fact, I was going over this talk briefly this morning, and I looked out my window, and this is what I saw, a little bug sticking on the window. And it's really the case with terrestrial systems, where there's phoebes and other plants and blossoming flowers and the fiddleheads that are poking their little heads out of the soil right now, where you can just look and see the changing phenology of the terrestrial landscape. Oceans are far more complicated, and they are essentially invisible. And in fact, if I ask you, what time of year was this picture taken, it might be hard to really discern, with the exception that it's in Maine, and probably if it was winter, there'd be some white on those peaks in the distance. It's the case, though, that the ocean is very difficult to observe, and we're very fortunate to have satellites that can record sea surface temperatures, or in this case, they've taken color differences and used it to show where there are blooms of phytoplankton occurring in mostly along shallow banks and along the shoreline, being driven by the fact that the light can penetrate to the bottom and enhance the growth of small, mostly unicellular and small multicellular phytoplankton. Fish, however, are very different. John Shepherd said that managing fisheries is hard. It's like managing a forest in which the trees are invisible and keep moving around. And I think that this is just the inevitable reality of working in the ocean ecosystem, is the fact that it's really difficult to observe these things. But it's really important. There are real consequences to these. Everybody, I think, is aware that there are specific seasons. And those seasons can bring on things like the turtle stranding season, which has important climate links. But also we just know that there are fishing seasons. There's a time that you can go to Maine, or sometimes you can go to Maine. This year was a particularly bad year for ice fishing. But there's a season for that, and there's a season where you can go and catch stripers or striped bass on the coast and other fish. So we know intuitively that there are seasons, but these seasons are changing. And they're different than they have been in the past. Another example, and really just very contemporary, if you look at the date here, is April 27th, so just a couple of weeks back, or a week or so back, where there's a fixed gear closure area within the Cape Cod Bay to protect right whales, endangered right whales, and there are adaptive management strategies in place to make adjustments to this timing based on the presence of those whales. And so on April 27th, the restrictions were extended, but 3 days later on April 30th, they were rescinded because the whales had moved on. And so it's just important to realize that there are real consequences to these seasons and to the fact that they may be changing in terms of the organism's response, and that those are going to impact then our activities and how we interact with those organisms. It's also really important to note that those organisms in the ocean are interacting with one another just as they do in the terrestrial ecosystem. That the changes in one species are going to have impacts on other species. And that's ultimately what we're very interested in, and it's going to be a major focus of this talk. So I'm going to introduce the rest of our work on phenology by focusing on this synthesis article that Michelle led. And I'm going to focus, it's mostly involved in the Gulf of Maine, which hopefully you can see my cursor is this enclosed bay, essentially, with these banks, Georges Bank and Scotian Shelf on the outer edge. This area is warming, especially in the past 10 to 15 years, has experienced rapid warming compared to the rest of the global oceans. That warming is occurring on a highly seasonal system. And so we anticipate that there will be changes in those organisms as they respond through their activities over those seasons, because their activities take advantage of specific conditions within the Gulf of Maine and within different parts of the Gulf of Maine to either undergo foraging or breeding in the case of marine mammals and seabirds, or spawning in the case of fish. So that warming is, because it's working within the seasonal cycle, is changing the way that the seasons are operating. And so what we have here is a figure showing the spring transition date moving 2 weeks earlier. Just very briefly, the spring and fall transitions are those dates at which the temperature crosses the long-term average for that region. So essentially marking in the spring the point at which for the rest of the year it'll be warmer than the average, and then in the fall when it becomes colder than the average for the quote-unquote winter in whatever region you're looking at. And so this transition is occurring earlier in the spring and later in the fall, such that the entire summer duration is increasing, and obviously the winter duration is decreasing. And we know that this is going to have important effects. It's not quite as simple as it just sunlight hitting the ocean and warming it up. The ocean is a complicated area with a lot of oceanographic and climate forcings. So some things we're going to talk about today that are just important to mention really right now is the Gulf Stream has an important influence in how close it is to the coastline by influencing water that can enter into the Gulf of Maine. We also have important effects of the North Atlantic Oscillation, which is essentially a descriptor of climate patterns across the northeastern United States, which can influence the ocean directly, but also influences patterns in precipitation. This is an entire talk in itself, and so I'm just going to leave it there by saying that these responses are going to be complicated by broad-scale climatic and oceanographic processes, and by the fact that these organisms all interact with each other within a food web. So this is a food web model that was developed by my graduate student, Bia Diaz, looking at, and specifically the Gulf of Maine region. I love this figure because it shows how interconnected these parts of the food web are as energy flows from low in the food web up through these small invertebrates mostly, through what we call our forage fish, and up to species like cod and haddock that we fish, as well as important organisms like seabirds and other marine mammals. And then, of course, our fisheries, which are a really important part of a state like Massachusetts, but really any coastal state. These complex interactions, then, it shouldn't be surprising that the responses are going to be complicated. So in our synthesis, we did a thorough literature review, and we found about 20 cases where we could detect a change in a species phenology. Obviously, we anticipated that the responses would follow what you would see in this line H at the bottom, at this shift in the seasonal transition, but that is not the case. And in fact, what we see is sort of a mixed response across different species and a difference in that response in terms of the magnitude. And we're worried or there's a concern that that could lead to there being mismatches. And for example, a fish moving into an area after a migration, but the main prey resource it would have depended on not being there because its phenology has shifted. Obviously, this is an exaggerated case, but it is sort of where we think that there could be important ecosystem consequences that would have further impacts on our fisheries and other activities. So we can imagine that there's going to be a complicated response to this the further up the food web you get, but it gets more complicated because not every organism is the same. Here at the top of this figure, which is a rather messy figure or busy figure, and I could spend some time on it, but we have a series of seasons that drive changes in physical processes of those systems, and that those then impact those lowest trophic levels. But the most important thing I want to get out of this is that there are a multitude of responses by these upper larger organisms, upper trophic levels, in response to these physical changes. And in particular, if we use this last example, which is the anadromous fish life strategy or seasonal strategy, where we have immigration from the ocean into freshwater systems, the reproduction and growth of those young, and an eventual emigration is being impacted not only by the ocean processes, but also by land-based and precipitation river outflow events. Those are also going to be important for any species living in the coastal ecosystems because river outflow will influence circulation patterns within that complicated circulation in these coastal oceans. So now I'm going to shift to a case study, and then I'm going to hand it off to Michelle for her to talk about the nesting seabirds as an example, and she'll finish up the talk with a discussion about some of the implications of this work as it relates to our management and adaptation of coastal management. So it's best to start with a very simple question. So our question is, have there been changes in the timing of a spring alewife spawning migration? And as a follow-up, what might be driving any of those changes that we're seeing? I think it's important to introduce this fish species a little bit more detail because its phenology is marked by these shifts in its habitat use. So actually currently, right now in our neck of the woods, we're seeing river herring moving into freshwater systems. They reproduce and leave these adhesive eggs that are semi-adhesive eggs that then incubate and hatch into these weird spaghetti-looking fish with little yolk sacs on them. Those then grow up eventually into these silverine juveniles, which over the course of the summer and fall will migrate out into the ocean, where they'll join an at-sea population, which at about 3 to 5 years of age will start making these spawning migrations. Once they've done this spawning migration, they can repeat that every year until they're either eaten or captured in a fishery. So that means that there are a series of phenological moments, or phenophases, as the National Phenology Network would call them. We're investigating aspects of spawning and hatching using otoliths of fish that we catch during the summer to back calculate the ages of those fish and understand the patterns in spawning and hatching. We're studying migration with other partners and researchers at the University of Massachusetts, trying to link it to conditions within the fresh water. If I started trying to talk about all of that, that would be the whole hour. So I'm just going to focus for today on this migration component and our key question. There is other data sources, but we're very fortunate that every year these fish make this migration and they make themselves available for counting individuals. And so here we have the picture is essentially a fish counting device. It's a electronic counter, which essentially has a beam of light that as the fish passes, it breaks that beam of light and that counts an individual fish. This, as well as video counters and citizen science, can accumulate these counts and create this data, which would be the size of the run that is occurring on a specific date throughout the year, showing, as you would expect, peaks and valleys associated with certain climatic variables, which we're not going to talk about today, but we're also investigating what is driving these day-to-day changes in the numbers of fish. Here's a great picture of an area where a citizen science counting would be an ideal location, where you get this little pale background where fish, as they move through the system, can be counted. And here are some examples of some fish. All right, so that's great. But let's really bring you into the middle of this run for a moment to show you what it actually looks like when you're underwater. These are river herring in the beginning of a spawning migration. And you'll see it's a rather chaotic looking event and really a wonder to see. And so if you ever get a chance, I highly recommend to go and do so, obviously with social distancing in effect. You'll also notice that there's some small little eels. These are young eels that have made their migration from the Sargasso Sea as young and are now moving up into these systems. A lot of questions about what drives these river herring runs and actually the consequences of those runs, which is something we spend a lot of time studying. We're very fortunate to have received data from the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries from 1990 to 2017 in 12 locations with annual and daily counts of those runs. I'm not going to show you all the data from all the years. Actually, I guess I will in a moment, but we'll just start breaking it down. So we take each run and we create these phenology metrics, the initiation, median, and end of the run, which correspond with the 5th, 50th, and 95th percentile of that run in terms of numbers. And so what we see when we look at these phenology metrics and how they're changing is that there's not a consistent change across the systems. And in fact, there's very few examples where we see in a specific system a significant change in that run. And if there is a response, it seems varied based on the system. This is, of course, rather interesting to ecologists, but a little bit more frustrating from a management perspective. There is a lot of interannual variation, though, and that interannual variation, as it turns out, is being driven by climate variables. And the most key variable in particular when it comes to initiation is the sea surface temperature in the winter. And so we see a significant impact when we do a modeling of the entire data set of this cold winter temperatures, sea surface temperatures. Here you can see that effect on the running initiation date with a scaled winter sea surface temperature in this model. So we have some impact of winter severity driving the timing of the beginning of the run. And so there's always a lag effect. The fish are responding to something that has happened in the past, not to the exact current conditions. Of course, there's a little bit of a nuanced view that I won't talk about too much about today, but it obviously gets more complicated than that. There's also an effect of latitude and run size. I'll come back to run size in a moment. The rest of those metrics, the median and end date, show a decreasing impact from that winter sea surface temperature, and you start seeing that spring transition date starting to have an impact, as well as that annual Gulf Stream index that in the median phenology index. And so what we can see is that there's always a lag, and that lag is closely related often to the season ahead of it. The end is a complicated affair, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, other than to say that it seems that a lot of things are affecting the end of the run, and it's probably being driven by a lot of factors that are really embedded in the precipitation, available water, and drought conditions that could prevail in certain years. But that's a part of a broader conversation. And I mention this because I think it's really important to think about that there are also populations. So we are undergoing active restoration of many of these populations because the species as a whole, or both species, alewife and blueback, are at relatively low abundances. And so those restoration activities are driving increases in run size, you would hope. And those are also imparting some changes in what we're seeing in terms of phenology metrics. This is marginally non-significant change in the, but a change nonetheless in the initiation date. As you can see, the end date is staying much more stable. And so what we're seeing is that there is an impact globally on all of the populations of run size, increasing or decreasing the day of the year, so an earlier initiation and a relatively steady end, and therefore also driving an increase in the duration of the run. We think that these have important management implications that Michelle will discuss towards the end. We're very fortunate to have received some Woods Hole Sea Grant funding to extend our work from looking just in freshwater and the marine to freshwater migration of the adults to asking questions about what happens in freshwater, in the river and the estuary to those young that are produced by those spawning runs. We're going to be taking samples from multiple locations and asking questions about what is happening to each of those, the demographics in each of those areas, and how there may be bottlenecks, in particular in the timing and movement, or are there particularly good times to be moving out of these systems in freshwater and moving into the estuaries. And eventually those individuals will join the at-sea population, and you can see that we have in multiple places here a life history population model. I'm very fortunate to work with our Division of Marine Fisheries in Massachusetts on a number of projects, and they continue to today. And this is one of the outputs of that. This project was led by Gary Nelson, Benjamin Gahagan, Mike Armstrong, myself, and Allison Bowden, asking questions about what are causing the population changes. And in order to do that, we created not a particularly simple model. I would say that Gary's not a fan of simple models. But it's a really interesting way of thinking about and testing whether there are impacts of certain conditions. And I'm just bringing this up to point out that river temperature influencing migration, lake temperature influencing spawning, as well as you could pick out a number of other places in this where there's an influence that has an important phenological aspect to it. The bigger problem is that we know very little about these impacts and mechanisms. One of the things you learn when you do this kind of activity is all the things you don't know. And here we found that we do not understand the environmental and physiological influences that affect adult immigration and young of year or juvenile immigration. And we have real issues of understanding what is going on in estuaries, the length of time that, these individuals are resident in estuaries. And we're hoping that we can sort of really understand all of this in the next few years as we gain more data. I'd be remiss to mention that we're really interested in those interactions among species. And here we have an alewife that's managed to have a lamprey find it somewhere in the ocean. And these interactions really are the sum of these individual time and space interactions, whether it's in a predator-prey sort of dynamic or otherwise. And those accumulate to form these complex ecosystems, which are really the source of what we're most interested in. I'll point out a couple of things here, that these river herring are part of this little Holocene box, and understanding how they are influencing the food web is important, but also understanding how the rest of the species are moving and how their phenologies are changing the interactions with other organisms. So those could be some commercially important species like winter flounder, which we're going to be starting to work on soon. It could be the fisheries themselves, and so engaging stakeholders directly and asking them what they're seeing and how they're responding and how they plan to respond to these changes in time is a really important aspect of this. And then last, there are really important species of concern such as seabirds, which are also going to be impacted by these changes. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Michelle. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. So in the second half of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on nesting seabirds in the Gulf of Maine and trying to answer the question to whether or not they're becoming temporally mismatched with their key prey. And I wanted to mention that this work has been conducted in collaboration with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Maine Coastal Islands National Wildlife Refuge, and National Audubon's Project Puffin and the Seabird Restoration Program, as well as a variety of state partners. And a lot of this work, the results of a master's thesis of a student, Keenan Nicola, that Adrian and I co-advised. He's also an island manager with Project Puffin and spent a great deal of time out on the islands with these birds. So a variety of seabirds migrate to the islands along the coast of Maine to breed and raise their young during the summer season. And some of these species, such as the Arctic tern, migrate as far as the Southern Ocean. This has earned them the award for making one of the longest migrations of any animal on Earth. We know that highly migratory animals are at higher risk for mismatches in the resources between the long distance between their overwintering grounds and their seasonal summer foraging and breeding grounds. And the highly productive waters of the Gulf of Maine has historically served these species quite well, providing high-quality prey to refuel them after their long journeys and provision their young during the nesting season. However, there's a lot of concern that shifting availability of some of their preferred prey may be limiting these populations. So Adrian already mentioned, but I think it's worth mentioning again, that we know that the Gulf of Maine is a hotspot of warming with rates of change 3 times the global average. And the fastest rates of warming have been observed in the system during the summer season, which is of particular importance to the seabirds, since this is when they're coming to nest and raise their young. We also know that a large variety of marine fishes and invertebrates that would serve as prey to seabirds and other higher trophic levels are showing adaptive capacity to climate change by shifting their ranges both latitudinally, typically moving north, as well as to deeper waters in search of thermal optima. And so we have well-known shifty prey, but not so shifty predators. In a recent meta-analysis of 145 seabird species, authors found that seabirds are not adjusting their breeding timing in response to changes in sea surface temperature. And so this disconnection between these different levels of the trophic level potentially could lead to problems for the survival of seabirds in the Gulf of Maine system. And this was motivation for this case study. So the analyses that I'm going to be talking about today and that we've been working on for the last few years have focused on a suite of tern species. Terns have some particular constraints on their foraging ecology. First, terns are somewhat small-bodied for seabirds, and they plunge dive at the surface, and they're only able to access prey within the very top few centimeters of the water column. And they also typically only carry a single prey item at a time. And they largely forage on young of year juvenile fishes. So second, they have a limited radius around their nesting islands in which they can access food. And so the further they have to fly to find food, the fewer trips they can make to provision their chicks, and the more energy they have to expend to raise their chicks. And of high concern is that cold water associated fish species are moving out of the Gulf of Maine, and warm water associated fishes are moving in. And one species of particular concern to seabird managers is this fish prey species shown here, which is the butterfish. This is a deep-bodied fish prey, and it takes quite a bit of energy and time for a chick to manipulate it and swallow it. Species is also considered lower quality prey species to some of the more historically important fish prey that terns and other seabirds have relied on, which are typically higher in lipids and fat reserves to help their chicks grow. So the last comprehensive study of tern foraging ecology in the Gulf of Maine was conducted about 20 years ago, and a lot has changed since with rising climate temperatures. So in working with our state and federal and nonprofit partners, we set out to quantify long-term trends in seabird foraging ecology in this region. And the National Audubon Seabird and Restoration Program and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has collected chick diet data since 1986. And so we're really lucky to be able to have access to this 30-plus year data series, which covers 4 species of terns: common, Arctic, the federally endangered roseate, and least tern, and covers 7 islands in the Gulf of Maine, shown on the right here. So we set out to evaluate tern diets across these 4 different species, across the 7 islands, and the 30-plus years of data, and also evaluate the underlying drivers of prey occurrence in your diets. So just to give you an idea of the amount of effort that goes into collecting these data, so this video, in this video you can see in the background, there's a bird blind and there's an observer monitoring these 2 chicks. And so interns and volunteers spend their entire summers out on these islands and hours each day and over the weeks and over the months during the season, recording these prey observations. And what you're observing here is this parent is delivering small sand lance to one of its 2 chicks. The chicks are also marked so that they can be tracked for their growth and survival throughout the summer nesting season. So in this slide, I'm showing the regional overview of the 4 different tern chicks diets. You can see the different species on the bottom left-hand corner and the frequency of occurrence of the major prey groups on each of these species diets. So the take-home here is that over the 30-year time series, over 70% of the fish prey in the 4 tern chick diets contained only 3 prey groups. So in the hake group, this is believed to mostly be white hake, but it also contains several other species, unknown proportions of offshore hake, silver hake, and four-beard rockling. There are 2 species of sand lance, an inshore and an offshore species that occur in the diets. The herring complex is primarily Atlantic herring, but also includes the 2 river herring species that Adrian talked about earlier, alewife and blueback herring. And then there's a variety of all sorts of different kinds of fish in the other fish category. The 2 main takeaways here are that the narrow diets on such a few species of prey makes these species more vulnerable to climate impacts and other stressors. There's also high potential for competition between the species that co-nest together on shared islands. If we look at the diets using a diet diversity index, which is shown on the y-axis in this plot, we see that Arctic and common terns have higher dietary diversity overall in comparison to least terns and roseate terns. And the higher dietary diversity largely comes from the fact that Arctic and common terns are consuming marine and terrestrial invertebrates, whereas least terns and roseate terns are fish specialists. And we know that across the range in the Northeast, roseate terns are not only fish specialists, but also sand lance specialists. And in a recent paper that I led that just came out in the last month, we looked across a variety of studies and found that roseate tern diets are consistently contained high amounts of sand lance, falling in around 30 to 100% of their total diet. So in some places, their diets are 100% of this 1 or 2 species of fish, which is pretty incredible. So there are exceptions, and we did find exceptions on one of the islands in our study system, Eastern Egg Rock. So in this pie chart, you can see that sand lance actually don't make up a large percentage of the overall diet of roseate terns over the time series that we evaluated. And their diets, and hake is more important in their diets at this location. We also found some evidence for adaptive capacity in this location, where in 1992, island, we found that roseate terns took advantage of unusually high amounts of another gatted species, pollock, and fed nearly 30% of their diets to their chicks. So there is some evidence that they may be able to take advantage of prey explosions when they occur. So for the next series of slides that I'm going to show, the results will only be focused on common terns. This was our most robust data series covering the most number of years and all of the islands. So here, the main thing that I want to show is some examples of how the trends in the diets vary across locations. So on the x-axis, we have years, and then on the y-axis, we have frequency of occurrence. And what you'll notice is we don't see the same trends across the different locations. So for example, on Stratton Island, we see that sand lance, which is shown in this brown line, that in the late 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s, sand lance was quite important to common tern diets. And then we see a large decline in the early 2000s before it increases again. And concurrent with the decline in the diet of sand lance, we see an increase in herring and hake in their diets. Now, when we look at Eastern Egg Rock and Jenny Island, we see that sand lance are provisioned to the chicks in much lower amounts. And we may even see a little bump in the frequency of occurrence during the same time periods where we saw a decline at Stratton Island. And so the take home here is that we don't see a unilateral response across the different locations, and there's quite a bit of variation, in fact. And so this indicates that the different colonies are subject to different localized conditions, and that decreases or increases in prey isn't affecting the colonies and populations equally across the Gulf of Maine. When we look at within-season dietary phenology, so in these plots here, we still have frequency of occurrence on the y-axis, but now we have day of year on the x-axis. And day of year, the earliest day of year 170 corresponds to approximately June 15th, which is when egg laying is occurring. Year day 192, sort of the midpoint of the chick rearing season, is around July 10th, where the chicks begin to hatch. And then the end of the season, year day 215, late July, early August, we see that's when chicks are starting to fledge. So here, the take home here is that we see different patterns of occurrence over the course of the chick rearing season. So for example, our cold water associated hake species are more important earlier in the chick rearing period, right after egg laying and up to hatching, whereas herring become more important later in the chick rearing period, more towards fledging. Salmons are more or less consistent over the chick rearing period, maybe showing a slight decline towards fledging. And interestingly, we see a slight increase in the probability of frequency of occurrence for our warm water associated butterfish, as well as the catch-all category for other fish. In this next analysis, we looked at how changes in temperature affected occurrence in tern diets. And so on the x-axis this time we have increasing sea surface temperature and the probability of frequency of occurrence in the diets. And so this is capturing the probability of occurrence of these different prey over time, given rising temperatures. And each one of these lines and each one of these plots represents a different island in this case. And what we can see is that with increasing sea surface temperature, we see a decreasing probability of the frequency of occurrence of our cold water associated heat. So that's what we would have expected. What we don't see is the increase in butterfish with warm water associated butterfish with increasing sea surface temperatures across the different islands, with the exception of one location, the Timicus Rock. And so this would be a colony that we would want to watch closely to see what the local foraging conditions look like during future extreme warm years and how that population responds to those temperature increases. Another important result here is with increasing sea surface temperature, we see an increase in the probability of frequency of occurrence of a diversity of these other fish species. And what we think is happening here is that as our cold water associated hake species are declining, the birds are needing to supplement their diet with whatever is most available in their local environments. And then the last result that I wanted to show from this case study is the relationship between that earlier spring transition date or earlier onset of spring that Adrian was talking about earlier and the probability of our cold water species. So here we see when spring arrives earlier, we see a lower probability of this cold water associated species. And so this is where we really see the greatest likelihood for potential temporal mismatch in this prey resource, given the shifting environmental seasonal conditions. So the work that I've just sort of walked you through is really just sort of the first step in a longer term goal to link prey conditions to population dynamics of these seabirds. And so our next steps are going to be to link the diets to chick growth and survival metrics and really try to dig in deeper on understanding what conditions make for a good or a bad year for these birds. And so now I'd like to wrap up with some implications and management strategies for how we deal with all of these shifts in phenology and changes to the way that species are interacting. So first of all, where, when, and how much species are shifting has a lot of impacts on socioecological and economic systems in the Gulf of Maine. It can impact the species population dynamics that we care about. It has potential implications for interactions with human activities, which I'll go into in a moment. And it also affects the efficacy of our management tools. So many of our management tools are fixed in time and space and do not well account for species shifting in response to climate change. And some examples of this are time of year restrictions, for example, water withdrawals and other activities within the coastal stream systems where diadromous fishes are migrating. Fishery seasons and closed areas are typically fixed in time. And the construction and operation windows of emerging industries will also be looking at historical trends, and these may not match with what's currently happening given recent warming and climate change. So we can't change species interactions, we can't change the timing in which species are occurring or moving. So how do we manage for shifting phenology? So I'm going to propose a few strategies, some of which are familiar, I think, to many managers working on these systems already. And the first is to manage across landscape scales and for diversity. By giving species a wide range of habitat and food options, we increase their resilience to a wider range of conditions. So this portfolio approach to maintaining a diversity of conditions for the species really thinks more holistically about what's happening across, for example, the Gulf of Maine as a whole rather than the individual points. But those individual points are really important to understanding how these localized systems are responding to local conditions. So in the alewife example, it may be to stream flow and stream temperature, whereas the seabird is local foraging conditions. And as Adrian talked about earlier, by restoring populations and reducing the influence of climate stressors, we can increase the resilience of that population overall. And in the case of alewife, we saw when we increase the population size or the run size, it increases the window in which the species are migrating through these systems. And that just gives the species more options in terms of the total range of environmental conditions that they can experience. Another thing to bring in here in terms of reducing non-climate stressors is to increase connectivity between key habitats for these species. So in the case of the diadromous fishes, we've done a really great job of blocking their access to historical habitat through dams and other barriers. So these two plots on the right-hand side of this slide show the available habitats of diadromous fish back in the 1500s and how much we cut off by the 1900s in terms of building dams and other barriers. So another way that we can help increase resilience at the system level is through holistic assessment of risk and vulnerability. So this recent report, The State of the Ecosystem, came out just in the last month or so. And this is typically given to fishery management councils reporting on the state of the fisheries. And in this past version of the report, they've made an effort to include information on specific species, including seabirds and marine mammals, and thinking about how they'd be affected by changes in fisheries. And so this was a big step forward, thinking about the system more holistically, and hopefully it will continue in the future. And along those lines, there's been a large movement towards ecosystem-based approaches to fisheries management, taking precautionary approaches that account for uncertainty, considering those species interactions, predator-prey relationships is really important, and thinking about protections for forage fish, whether they're managed or unmanaged. We know from our work that there's a direct relationship between seeing a herring in the diets of the seabirds and herring recruitment. And in recent years, there's been a number of steps that have been taken to protect forage fish and thinking about the needs of these higher-level predators. In some of the recent control rules, there's been restrictions on catch in coastal areas that include seabird nesting habitats, and hopefully will lead to reduce localized depletions of the species that these birds are relying on during this critical period. And then lastly, as Adrian was talking about earlier, there's a balance to be struck between looking at the historical long-term trends in real-time monitoring. So in Cape Cod Bay, which is a critical foraging ground for North Atlantic right whales, there are seasonal closures and speed limits to protect these whales. And so we know from recent years that these closures have been pushed later and later into the year. And our work with our collaborators at the Anderson Cabot Center for Marine Life and at the New England Aquarium has shown that the habitat use of Cape Cod Bay by right whales has actually shifted by nearly 3 weeks over the last 20 years. And so looking at these long-term trends in habitat use is really important. But if you look at this plot, you can also see that there's a lot of variation. And so we still need the real-time monitoring to then know when the whales have left the area and these restrictions can be lifted. So there's a balance to be struck. So just to wrap up, our work has shown that shifts in phenology vary widely across coastal and marine species and populations in the Gulf of Maine. A lot of our results are showing, are challenging previous assumptions about what we know about phenological shifts. For example, in terrestrial systems, the sort of default is that timing is shifting earlier, and that's not necessarily true in marine systems. The high variability across populations creates uncertainty for management, which is very difficult, but it actually may create resilience across ecological and ecosystem scales. If every population within the region was responding the same way, then they'd all be exposed to the same amount of risk. So this variability should be monitored carefully and scaled up so that we can better understand what's happening both at the local level and the ecosystem scale. And these ecosystems perspectives are really important to understand how different components of the system are responding relative to each other. Some of the ecosystem modeling results that Adrian was showing earlier in this talk, you can see that all of these species are connected and can sometimes have unintended or surprising results when changes in how changes in one species might affect another. And so we do need to think about precautionary approaches to buffer against the uncertainty and unknowns. And then finally, it's really important that we engage stakeholders and understand their perceptions and their responses to the changes in the species that they rely on, so that we understand how they're going to respond to the system changes, and so that our management strategies, so that we have buy-in to the management strategies that we might need to evoke to account for the shifts in timing of the species that we care about. And with that, I'd like to thank all of the people that have contributed to this work. We have a really wonderful collaborative group spanning multiple institutions. And everyone, this has just been wonderful to work with. And if you'd like to learn more about any of this work, there's a number of products available on the Climate Adaptation Science Center website under the projects page. With that, this will take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your very interesting findings with us, Adrian and Michelle. It looks like we have some time left over for questions, and we have a few that have come up during the presentation. Our first question is for Adrian, and that was, what is the temperature value you used for the spring transition date?
Wow, that's a great question. So that's like asking me a very tough question to actually know what was used at the specific value. I will say that in the figure that was showing the shift in the spring transition dates, those the temperatures used are associated with those, and so they're the average long-term mean of the specific location for which we're talking, and those figures had a number of different locations, including the Gulf of Maine. And so it's for that body of water within that body. And so it's different for each of those regions, obviously, because their average temperatures are different. If you're really interested, you could send me an email and I'll dig up the actual values and get them to you. But that's what I have as an answer right now.
I'd also mention that Kevin Friedland at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center calculates these values for multiple regions on a quarterly basis, and they can be accessed on the Northeast Fisheries Science Center webpage, or if you just Google search for spring transition dates, it should come up.
Sorry about that. I should have realized I had an opportunity to give Kevin some props.
We did get, it looks like another question for Adrian. There was a comment that I understood regarding that runs are not consistent for herring, and that it is great for an ecological perspective, but frustrating from a management perspective. Humans overmanage nature. Please provide comment on how management of nature has led to detrimental effects. That we not just let nature happen. Maybe with climate change, we have to help, but recognize human activity has greatly influenced the effects of climate change for monitoring feeding activity of terns. Now, you had mentioned that chicks are marked. How is that done? Some bird species do abandon their brood if they have been handled by humans.
All right. Well, that was two questions. I'm going to let Michelle take the monitoring chicks question. So, you know, this question on the perspective here of management. So, me personally, I view management as really only being able to be effective on people, and so the management that I'm talking about is our actions that we would undertake in these systems. And so, for example, with river herring runs, we have dredging windows and water withdrawals that are impacting a couple of different life stages during the migration. So basically, you're trying to avoid impacting them during the spawning time. And that works well if you know what that time window is, but it obviously starts breaking apart if that is shifting over time. And so the challenge is not, from a management perspective, is not managing the river herring themselves, it's managing the activities that we engage in within these coastal watersheds and in those areas that they're active during residence of the region. And that's the challenge. And how to deal with that as the climate changes, we experience differing rainfall and climate variables, as well as onset of drought and so forth, which really complicate being able to make appropriate time and place restrictions work for that species. I hope that answered the question.
Looks like we got another question in the Q&A box. Why did puffin phenology get later when spring phenology got earlier?
So that's a great question. And that was one of the studies, I believe, in the Gulf of Maine synthesis. And I do not believe that paper looks at the underlying drivers, but I would have to go back and look. And so that's really the key question, is that we don't know why species are shifting later in every case or earlier. And so looking at those underlying environmental drivers and linking them to those life events is really, the crux of all of this work. But I did want to answer the other question that came in about marking the chicks. At least for terns, I can say that handling the chicks doesn't affect whether the parents will return to them. And in fact, the parents are quite attentive when the chicks are being marked and handled for growth studies. They love to dive bomb your head, and we have to wear hard hats when we're out there, or deterrents on the top of our heads to keep them from basically trying to attack us the entire time we're handling the chicks. Part of these provisioning plots where the chicks are being monitored, they're actually just sort of fenced off with this very low fencing that the birds can actually hop over, and of course the adults can just fly over and access their chicks. The chicks are just marked with a colored marker, and so that just stains their feathers. And then we take information like wing cord length and weight throughout the rearing season to track their growth and measure them every several days. But it doesn't affect the parents coming back to them.
I'm just going to follow up really quickly on something that Michelle mentioned about the puffins. I don't want to be quoted on this exactly, but my recollection of that study is to do with the fact that as the prey shifts and you get less ideal prey, that the time it takes then to brood the chicks and have them fledge goes later. And so this is one of those places where there's an unusual effect that is mediated through a predator-prey relationship. And if I'm wrong, someone can send me an email, but I do believe that was the reasoning for that, although it was a long time ago that we did that work, so I'd have to go back.
We got another question. Your holistic assessments of risk and vulnerability seem to focus on ecosystem. However, to get buy-in from all stakeholders, have you given thought to potentially expanding this holistic assessment to incorporate other sectors, perhaps infrastructure or economy?
So I wasn't involved in the State of the Ecosystem report, and it is intended, I think, the primary audience for that report is the fishery management councils, and they do take into account social and economic as well as ecological changes in the system. They take into account oceanographic and climate changes in influencing the dynamics of the commercially managed fish stocks. I don't know how, I'm not familiar with their engagement process for different sectors, but I know that they try to capture the effects, at least on different sectors. I'd have to defer more to our colleagues at NOAA to answer that question further.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and add a couple of things. So the State of the Ecosystem report does contain socioeconomic indicators, although they're rather at large scales. And so I'll just add to say that we recognize this as a really, really important part of our research in the future, and that you know, we think that engagement of stakeholders is a critical part of developing a functional and actual working adaptive strategies. And we have a project out of the Gloucester Marine Station that is focusing on engaging stakeholders within Massachusetts specifically, although obviously there's a broader conversation here, and trying to understand where some of these issues are and how to address them. And so, but this is a long-term goal and something that we would, you know, that is just going to be a slow march. And there's a lot of different activities that can be impacted by these shifts, whether it's fishing or whether it's offshore wind. And there's a lot of, these are very contentious potentially, and need just a lot of listening and engagement.
Yes. Why no apparent response of warm water fish to increasing temperatures?
Well, so I just wanted to clarify that the currents data that I was showing was the frequency of occurrence in the tern diets. That's not the same as the frequency of occurrence in the environment, and so that would be pretty critical information to compare to see if there is any behavioral aspects of the way that the terns are foraging and any preference that they might be exerting in what prey they're selecting from the environment, which is resulting in those trends. And so we still would need that information, and there's some great data out there that is collected, for example, by the National Marine Fisheries Service in terms of larval distribution and adult distribution in the environment. And a lot of the state agencies also collect data in more inshore areas that would overlap with the seabird foraging areas. The main challenge is the level of spatial and daily resolution that we would need for those data to be collected at to truly make a comparison of what's in the tern diets versus what's in the environment. Based on the data that's available, we can get some sort of more general spatial and temporal trends. And we haven't yet looked at butterfish in the environment from those scientific survey data. So what we were showing today was just really what's reflected in the diet. So that'd be a great next step to answer that question.
I will just add very briefly that we did see the increase in other fish, and so I suspect that if you break that down, you'll see that there are some more warmer water species involved in that. But you know, this area of the Gulf of Maine is, I think, somewhat more resilient to the advancement of these warm water fish because it gets pretty cold in the wintertime. So I think that this is a bit of also just the reality that herring are going to remain an important part of the diets, and hake are going to and sandlance are going to remain an important part of those diets.
Yeah, that actually just reminded me that we have seen an increase in haddock and pollock. I mentioned pollock, but haddock also is another gadded species that seems to be benefiting from the warmer temperatures in the Gulf of Maine, and we have seen their populations increase in recent years, and so these could be two potential species that we're seeing in the diets. I may not have detailed so much in our slides, but that we know are benefiting from warming temperatures and that the birds are finding. So that is something to look into further as well.
But just wanted to say on behalf of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services and the U.S. Geological Survey's National Climate Adaptation Science Center, I wanted to say thank you very much to Adrian and Michelle for taking time out of your day to share your very interesting case studies with us and being with us here today. Thank you again to everyone for attending today's webinar. See you again soon.